Wow, what a crowd. Or is it that just the room feels a little smaller compared to like some of the other rooms? And by the way, all of you guys all the way in the back, I mean, I do try to use big fonts and everything else, but I noticed when I came in that this projector is not nearly as powerful as the ones in some of the other rooms. So do feel free to move forward. You can do a little defragmentation right now. No? No? Maybe? Okay, okay, I see some brave, I've got some brave souls. First row, completely available. And that way you're closer to me. All right? And I think, I hope, I'm in good shape. You know, I'm like yesterday, how many attended my presentation yesterday? Yeah, so, you know, like yesterday I was not really nervous, but whenever I have to demo anything, you know, especially since I haven't sacrificed the requisite number of chickens, yeah, I get a little iffy. Okay, great. So I think we can start the recording. Whoa, okay, so great. Hi, everybody. My name is Luis Sala. I'm Alfresco's Director of Solutions, excuse me, I'm sorry, Director of Solutions Engineering. That was my old title like a million years ago, back when I was SE manager. No, I'm Alfresco's Director of Technology Alliances, so I manage Alfresco's relationship with technology companies and whatnot. And I'm a part-time hacker. Basically, I get to have all the fun without any of the responsibility. It's pretty cool. So some of you may have seen this, you know, those of you that attended my presentation yesterday. We're going to have a very short recap, only about 3 slides from there. And my presentation is predicated on the concept that Alfresco can be a viable platform for content-centric applications. We are so accustomed nowadays of using Alfresco primarily like through the share user interface, or you know, there are some people who have created new user interfaces for Alfresco, like the guys from WeWebU. But they tend to use Alfresco primarily as a document repository, and more importantly, I'm serious when I say documents, right? It's about contracts and purchase orders and that type of stuff. When in reality, at least the way I feel about it, Alfresco can be used for all types of content, whether it's multimedia, you know, digital assets, as well as traditional structured and unstructured content. And as such, what I want to encourage you guys to do is to start thinking about Alfresco as this platform for building content-centric applications. So there are all types of apps that you could potentially build that would include Alfresco and content at their core, things like BI and so forth, and there are plenty of examples out there. But the basic model here then is that we would have, you know, I forgot to change this slide since I did copy paste it from the previous one, but the basic model is one where you would have some kind of a device, whether it's, you know, your desktop browser or mobile device, etc., that's accessing Alfresco through our standardized APIs, right? And might as well point out, since I did copy paste, you know, we do have our mobile SDKs for native SDKs for iOS and Android available, so might as well, you know, if you guys are interested, check it out. And if you did not attend my session yesterday, you know, I strongly encourage you guys to check out the recording and the slides. I did post them yesterday, so hopefully they made it up to the site. All right, so let's talk about what's new with HTML5. And I'm not going to go into a whole HTML5 like review or anything along those lines. You know, I think presumably many of us are familiar with HTML and JavaScript. Raise your hand if you are not. Okay, great. That makes things a lot easier for me. So I'm just going to highlight a few things. First, HTML5 includes some new tags, you know, mostly about, you know, semantic layout and so forth. So there's a nav tag and a footer tag and audio and video tags and so forth that replace things like the object plugin, you know, types of tags. But the things that I'm particularly interested in are these 3. And there's a lot more to HTML5 than just this, right? Right, but I think web storage, or just the ability to use local storage to store things of much larger size than cookies, you know, would normally have permitted you to use, I think is a powerful feature. IndexedDB, while still not yet fully available on all the browsers, you know, I think it's a very powerful mechanism for storing, you know, kind of SQL queryable types of content. And then the file API, I think is really significant. Browsers are going to be able to, and are able to now, do more complex manipulations of files within your desktop environment and so forth. And so I think those are things that lend themselves nicely to content-based applications where you might need to do some file manipulation and so forth. So that's it as far as like my HTML5 review, right? So let's talk a little bit about single page apps. A lot of what I'm going to be kind of talking about is developing single page applications that avoid the whole round trip, fetch an HTML page, render it, load the JavaScript, and all that stuff, because that makes an app slow. And so ideally, in many situations, maybe not all, it makes sense to try to encapsulate all your business logic into one collection of JavaScript files, HTML, CSS, etc., so that you have one app that all it does is send data back and forth between the browser and the backend, whatever your backend may be, and of course Alfresco would be one of those. And you can use certain optimizations with single page applications to help mitigate performance issues such as asynchronous module loading and also minification and compression and so forth. Is anybody not familiar with minification of JavaScript, for example? Not familiar? Okay. All right, good. So, wow, why are you here? No, just kidding. It's all good. So some examples of single page apps, these are things that we're all familiar with, right? Gmail is a canonical example of a single page app, right? When you click around Gmail and everything else, you notice the URL doesn't change, the UI doesn't refresh, right? It's subcomponents of the page do. And generally, it's what makes Gmail such a speedy web app, right? And similarly, Alfresco-Share, not Alfresco-Share as a whole, but certain subcomponents of Share, particularly and notably the document library, is effectively a single page app of sorts. And it can actually be broken out and encapsulated as a standalone component in some other application. Not many people do it, but it is a technical feasibility. That said, Alfresco as a whole is not a good example. Alfresco-Share specifically is not a good example of a single page app. In fact, it is not a single page app, it's a multi-page app, and there are reasons, that's one of the reasons why I sometimes kind of get a little frustrated with it. By the way, I should be pointing out here that one of the key principles behind the model that I'm going to be describing is that you do not necessarily render any kind of layout within your HTML the way that Alfresco-Share and SpringServe and stuff like that do it. So all you're doing is developing on the back end just JSON services and leave the layout to the front end, to the JavaScript, CSS, etc. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Facebook Web and Twitter's web apps are another, by the way, example of single-page web apps. And I'm not going to go into the whole debate as to whether the whole Mark Zuckerberg saying we messed up with HTML5, and yes, they did, but there are places where you can use it, and there are places where it doesn't make sense. Okay, so we can talk about that a little bit later. I discussed yesterday and want to reiterate that I tend to use the following definitions when it comes to frameworks versus platforms. And so framework is usually what you use to develop your client-side logic. And there are plenty of JavaScript frameworks that you can use to develop your applications, Sencha Touch, Ember.js, and I'm going to focus today's presentation on Ember.js, Backbone, Angular. There quite literally, there's a new JavaScript framework born every 3 seconds. And they die just as frequently. But there are a couple that are long-lived, that are viable and real, they're really, really good. And so they're worth looking at. So, in any case, many of these frameworks are going to provide you with client-side MVC, not to be confused with the traditional, the MVC pattern that we've grown accustomed to nowadays, where your model is basically encapsulated in say, enterprise Java beans, and of course the backend data store, where your controller logic is the EJB controller logic and everything else, and then your views are JSPs, for example, in the old school JSP days. Does anybody still develop like in JSP versus Grails or something? JSP, no, yes, a few. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you have to. No. Sometimes somebody's putting a gun to your head and basically say, you want to get paid. That's the gangster gun hold. Anyway, sorry. Whoa, feedback. Right. So oftentimes they give you this client-side MVC stack, and also sometimes they give you build and packaging tools. Not all of them do, and there are additional build and packaging tools that I'll be describing that you can use to basically grab all your basically all your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and kind of bundle it all together into a nice, tight, little, concise package that then you can deploy and so forth. So that was frameworks. Platforms the way, in my definition, are the things that represent your backend, right? And there are two primary flavors of them, and there are many different like hosted platforms that you can use. Of course, anytime you develop your own server-side logic, you're effectively creating a mini platform of sorts, right? So there's plenty of these in the cloud, StackMob, Heroku, and everything else. Anybody not familiar with Heroku, for example? No? Okay. Check it out, Heroku.com. It's just, if you need to hack a quick little project for free, you can write some code and you can do, basically git push Heroku, and that's it. It's like really, really easy. And your code is up there in the cloud, and all of a sudden you can start testing and so forth. It's awesome. And in fact, a lot of the apps that I'm going to be showing you are deployed to Heroku so that they can integrate with some, AWS-hosted Alfresco servers and so forth. And that way, I don't have to run any servers on my laptop and so forth. Oftentimes, these platforms provide you a data persistence layer, usually in the form of some kind of a RESTful API or something along those lines. And sometimes these are NoSQL based. And certainly, oftentimes, they also allow you to encapsulate and deploy your server-side logic. Okay? So I'm going to propose an architecture for content apps, particularly Alfresco-powered, if you will, content applications. And it's very straightforward. But it's one that maybe as Alfresco developers, you may not necessarily be comfortable with, or maybe you just simply may not think is viable. But honestly, I'm just sick and tired of customizing share. But then again, I don't have to do it on a day-to-day basis, but when I do, I don't want to. And I think we tend to fall into the trap of basically saying, well, share or explore, that's kind of like what we want, but I don't want to build a new app, so I'm just going to go ahead and start mucking around with Java server faces or surf and everything else. And all of a sudden, you just branched Alfresco. You did, and that's going to pose up a nightmare when you upgrade. And I do understand that share today has great extensibility features that are much superior to the model that was available in the 3.x days. But I think that if you don't necessarily want share as is, and you're not necessarily in your use case, you do not need or you're not going to be satisfied with the existing plugin models for, say, dashlets or inlining actions and stuff like that. Then perhaps you might want to consider creating a single-purpose HTML5 app that focuses on your use case. Maybe not. I admit that I am taking a somewhat biased approach, okay, and very opinionated approach, and perhaps slightly polarizing, but that's kind of my take. In any case, the idea here then is that if you're not going to be extending Alfresco directly, like changing the UI and everything else on the existing web apps, then you need to basically create a whole new web app. And for a variety of different reasons then, it might make sense for you to take any custom server-side logic and, not run it in process, not run it inside Alfresco, run it as a separate thing. And so the architecture that I propose is one where you have Alfresco effectively being a black box, a CMIS and JSON accessible database for content. Okay? And then you create middleware using your platform of choice, your server-side environments of choice. I personally, just because I'm lazy, I've elected to use an end-to-end JavaScript stack. So sometimes I write little web scripts to do one little Alfresco specific thing, and then I have Node.js in the middle, and that's going to be represent a lot of my custom logic that might do some routing and aggregation of a bunch of different backend services. So if I need to integrate whatever, in my case, I have an example that uses Amazon's DynamoDB and Alfresco and a couple other services. I collect them all, and then I have this middleware that provides an extended API layer, and then on top of that, I have my HTML5 client that in turn invokes all the services through the middleware. So in this example, I'm showing HTML5 using CMIS to talk to the middleware, but in reality, the middleware is just proxying CMIS. So it uses a proxy pattern to proxy the CMIS to Alfresco and then retrieve, basically return the content back into Alfresco. So that's kind of the basic model. And then, the same model applies to any additional services that you might be aggregating on the back end. So, so that's kind of the basic idea. The middleware acting as a proxy, and your Alfresco-specific customizations are kept to a minimum. Once again, this may not apply to all your projects, and so just be judicious about it, but this is the model that I'm espousing in this particular conversation. So let's go ahead and talk about Ember. It has a very cute little mascot, and I actually happen to have worked with the guys behind Ember. I had left Alfresco for a whopping 8 months and then came back. And during that time, I worked with these guys, and I can tell you that 2 of them actually look exactly like that. I am not kidding you. It's all about the hipster glasses and chubby hamster type of body frame. So imagine 2 guys, one of them with just the glasses and a beard, and then the other guy that's just kind of the hamster body, and that's it. And this is going to the recording, isn't it? All right, so what's Ember? It's one of many frameworks, okay, but I'm going to focus on just this one, and I think it's pretty awesome. And it is the spiritual successor to something called Sprout Core, which is used by Apple on all their iCloud services. So you go to iCloud.com, you're touching a Sprout Core app, which uses the same basic model as Ember. But Ember is described as a framework for building ambitious web applications. And what it basically gives you, first and foremost, is a client-side, browser-side MVC framework. It borrows from Cocoa by giving you key value observing. And the value of KVO cannot be understated. Because any of you guys that have used jQuery, and you have, for example, a page where, let's say it's a page where you're listing, you know, whatever, 20 items, and you need to, you know, somewhere on your page you need to say, here are, you know, I'm showing you 20, and then somewhere else you might need to enumerate or whatever. You need to update the same value in different places. If you just use plain old jQuery, then first and foremost you need to bind to the event whenever your data model changes, right? And then you have to, you have to explicitly call out to every single location within your browser DOM where you have to update that value. And I cannot tell you just how painful that can be. And so Ember just gets rid of that. Yeah, it just does it for you. You can automatically bind your view to your model. And you can also attach observers that can trigger and execute custom actions, basically custom actions based on the fact that a given value within your data model or within even the UI has changed. And once you wrap your head around KVO, honestly, I don't think that you're gonna look at just pretty much all the JavaScript frameworks and just kind of go like, eh. But that's just my opinion, I hope. So it also gives you computed properties, which actually takes advantage of this KVO concept to allow you to do things, and I'll show you an example in just a moment, to allow you to do things like if you have a data model that has, for example, a first name field and a last name field, and you want, but your data model does not, and your backend data source either, does not have a full name property, but you still need the full name, right? And you don't want to be concatenating first and last name all the time. You can actually extend your model within Ember, and Sprout Core as well, but Ember, and basically say, create a computed property called full name that concatenates, pre-concatenates first and last name, and more importantly, you can tell it to bind itself to the first and last name properties so that whenever any of them change, so if, let's say, I guess my last name won't change when I get married, but let's say I'm a girl and I get married and my last name changes, and at that point, the data model changes and I want to make sure that I update the first and last name. And so that automatically triggers the recalculation. Otherwise, your properties get cached, so it's very performant, very good stuff. It also enjoys template-driven views, and by default it uses something called handlebars, and you'll see a little bit of handlebars code shortly. Ultimately, it's HTML templates with little curly braces, and then you have your properties and little helpers to iterate through data sets and so forth and so on. Very, very nice, but you can actually plug in your templating engine of choice, and these are JavaScript templating engines, not server-side templates. I just want to make sure I iterate that. And it has a state machine-based routers. And I think, I was a computer science graduate, and the first and last time that I worked with a state machine, explicitly thinking of it as a state machine was in computer science, right? Was in college. And I don't know about you guys, when you develop your applications, I have a funny feeling that, like me, you were probably not thinking about encapsulating state using the concept of finite state machines and transitions. And if you were, I'd like to hear from you. Do any of you guys use state machines at all in your apps? And do you guys, okay, so you don't have apps that have state machines, right? And how hard is it sometimes to debug a particular problem that you think is associated with maybe, one particular view or something along those lines? Is the audio still going? Okay, I'm sorry. I stopped hearing myself for a moment. I think I went deaf. So, that's associated with one view, and but in reality, it was actually caused by some previous screen and an error in a screen where you're setting a variable that actually belongs to a different view from within a different screen. I know it's a rather abstract way of describing it, but what it boils down to is that if you don't think of things as having discrete states and all the properties related to the views that are attached to that state are always encapsulated in that state, then you have basically a lot of spaghetti code, because you're basically referencing variables and properties that are all over your different models. And so anyway, so state machines can be awesome, but you have to honestly just revert back to computer science and start thinking about this idea. Okay, so here's a very simple prototypical Ember app, overly simplistic. Hopefully for you guys in the back, the font is legible enough. If it isn't, I can zoom in. Can you guys read it in the back? Yes or no? I see some nods. Okay. Zoom? Is that okay? Okay. All right. So we're good. So basically, I've just embedded it as. And by the way, I'm not sure this will actually run, but because well, obviously, I'm not including like Ember.js or anything or jQuery. By the way, Ember is really, you can also think of it as an extension to jQuery. So jQuery is not a framework, really, right? It's just it's really a utility. And so by taking Ember and attaching it to jQuery, then you get some really cool stuff going. Anyway, so I'm going to create an application. So it's really a namespace. So I say, that first line there, right there. So create my application, ember.application.create, and that just creates a namespace. And then I can start attaching things to that namespace. So Ember has an object-oriented model, and it does support actually mix-ins or I guess the equivalent of aspects, right? But we can go into that a little bit later. But here I'm going to define an object that has a first name property, a last name property, and here's a computed property called full name. And so I'm just going to, I'm hard coding everything in here except the full name, which, as you can see, it is a function that returns the concatenation of the first name and last name. Notice the use of this.get. So in order for data bindings to work within the Ember.js framework, you need to use the, basically explicit getters and setters. That is an unfortunate side effect of the way that JavaScript works. So this is the only way that you can ensure that your bindings are observed and are triggered accordingly. So always use getters and setters. You can forego using them when you're dealing with strictly private member variables. So, but generally speaking, you want to use this.get. So it concatenates the first and last name, and then we basically, in a sense, flag it as a property that depends on first name and last name. So this establishes a data binding to the first and last name properties of this Ember object of type, called myapp.president, and whenever any of those changes, it will automatically recalculate the full name. Okay, and then inside here, I have a handlebars template. You can inline your handlebars template straight inside your HTML code, or you can, if you use build tools, you can actually have your handlebars templates be separate files that get basically compiled into, I say compiled, but translated into JavaScript and then attached to your JavaScript file. There's different mechanisms, and I'll show you a little bit of that a little bit later. But here we go. We basically say the president is myapp.president full name, right? So that's it. It's a very simple example. Oops, I didn't mean to press escape. So let me go back here. Okay, great. Now, We will look at Ember a little bit more closely a little bit later, but I want to talk to you about AlfJS. AlfJS is a JavaScript library that I developed, and I make no warranties or claims about it, but the spirit and the idea behind AlfJS is that it should make it easy for you to develop Alfresco-powered applications by making it, by facilitating things like logging in, retrieving certain Alfresco objects, sites, documents, nodes, and stuff like that, and basically being able to interact with the repository. In its current incarnation, it is strictly a read-only library, and I will tell you right now that I want help, because my full-time job is actually business development. It's not development. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually switch to a separate presentation that I did on AlfJS. So that's what I shall do, assuming I remember which of my tabs has it. Here it is. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about AlfJS. All right. So this, by the way, is an HTML5 presentation. And there's a reason why I built it in HTML5, and you'll see that a little bit later. But basically, it's a JavaScript library. It is, ideally suited for HTML5 applications. But the way that I developed it would also work with server-side JavaScript engines, including Node.js, and presumably with a little tweaking, we could probably make it work with Rhino. And this is a successor to Rhino, by the way. Did you guys hear about that? I recall the name now, but Mozilla or somebody is writing a new JavaScript, runtime for Java that will succeed Rhino. But anyway, so the whole idea here is that it's suited for server-side JavaScript development as well as browser-side, and it's designed to be standalone. So it has no external dependencies. It doesn't depend on jQuery or anything like that. So I embedded my own little Ajax kind of library to wrap around it, XML HTTP requests. So it's supposed to be easy to use and easy to customize and extend. So let's go ahead and learn a little bit about how to use it. So first and foremost, I want to point you to the site where it's at. So it's hosted at github.com/alfrescolab/alfjs, and so we can take a quick look at that. So there it is, and so you can check it out, follow it, and more importantly, contribute, please. I could use any help. But the beauty of AlfJS is that I documented it as best I could, and so there's lots of code samples showing you how to invoke it, and we'll go through that in just a moment. Plus, I did build some basic unit tests, or actually behavior-driven tests with the same idea, so that we can test it and make sure that all tests pass before we do a release or anything like that. You can download it by clicking the download link on the right-hand side of the site. So after you pick up AlfJS and you unpack it, you're going to see that there's basically two distributions or two versions of it. One of them is the Node.js version that includes a package.json manifest, and then the other one is just the full version of AlfJS, and then there's a minified version of AlfJS. Okay, so when you use AlfJS, basically what you want to do is first you want to create a connection. And so you call create connection, you pass it along some basic properties identifying your Alfresco environment. And that's basically it there. And before I continue, I want to talk a little bit about JavaScript callbacks. Presumably you guys are familiar with JavaScript callbacks. Are you not? Is anybody not familiar with the callback model? Okay, good. So AlfJS makes heavy use of success and failure or error callbacks, and so I just want to make sure that you guys were aware of that. So an example of how this would work is, I'm going to tell the some arbitrary data store, and this is just a hypothetical object, but hypothetical data store to load user accounts, and then I would have a callback function that gets executed when we succeed, and a callback function that executes when an error occurs, right? And so we make use of that here. So for example, if I wanted to test logins, or basically log into Alfresco, I would call the login function against the connection that I create and initialize using the properties I previously created, and I would call I would have a success callback and an error callback. And so the reason why I built this in HTML5 was so that I could actually run an example live right here. And so by running this, I get an Alfresco ticket. I'm actually thinking of getting rid of the ticket-based approach and just sticking to HTTP basic, and then also adding OAuth. So this could theoretically work with Alfresco in the cloud, except that that will be predicated on having a CMS.js library Now I'm teasing one of my wishes for the future. But anyway, all right. So far so good? Any problems? Am I going too slow? How am I doing in time? Okay, great. So if you wanted to fetch sites, there is a get sites function. And once again, if you run this, and here I'm using, by the way, just as in this code sample, I'm using underscore just as a simple way of iterating through properties and everything else. But anyway, so I'm just going to go run it, and I can get the different sites that exist within that particular Alfresco server. And if I wanted to fetch documents, so you can see the pattern repeats itself, right? So here's the documents that exist within a certain folder, right? And I just, as you can see, it's all documents. There's no folders in there, right? And if you wanted to then get a node, you get it by the node ref. And so there's the data there. And these are our live queries that are running against the server. So now let's kind of put it all together, and I'm going to show you an app, and this app is called CoPresent. CoPresent is a very early cut of a little meeting app that I wrote, and honestly I haven't not touched it in I think about 5 months. But I'm excited about this idea, and I'm going to release it on GitHub on the Alfresco Labs account within the next week. So what it is, and the basic premise is that if we're all in a meeting and we've got our iPads or laptops or whatever, and we're all looking at the same presentation, wouldn't it make sense to have it visible within our device, and as we paginate, as the leader, as the presenter, paginates through the document, we see the pages update automatically, right? I think it's a nice, simple use case, and it's a good example of a single-purpose app. And I think, Alfresco as a collaborative platform could definitely benefit from having this capability. And there's no reason why it necessarily needs to be built directly into Share. It could easily just work as a standalone app. So the way that I'm emulating it here, or not emulating it, but running it here is I'm just going to run it on two side-by-side iframes. But this does work on the iPad, it works on desktop browsers, and it works on the iPhone, although I did not optimize it as well as I could have for smaller screens. In fact, you're going to see as we go through the presentation here, even this iframe is a little too narrow for the way that it currently works. But on the frame on the left, I'm going to, I say the left, it is anyway, you know how it works. I'm going to say I'm the presenter. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I'm going to provide my credentials to my demo Alfresco server and log in. And so this is using AlfJS, and it is an Ember-based app, and it does make use of state charts. And uses Twitter Bootstrap, by the way, for the UI. And so now I'm going to browse that same site that I was showing you a little earlier. And I can just click around or touch. Find a document that's of interest, so I'm just going to choose this PowerPoint presentation here. And this is going to be a little slow right now because this current incarnation makes use of PDF.js, a JavaScript PDF renderer, which is relatively slow, especially on tablets and iPhones. But there is a newer version that I have not upgraded to yet that's supposedly a little bit faster. But so you can see the presentation is here, right? And more importantly, as you could probably see right here, there's a little code, a 3-letter code. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that code right in here. So IUG, and this could be my separate iPad. I could have brought it out and so forth. But enter that code in there, hit join. And now the client is going to connect to the same meeting room via WebSockets. And it's going to then find out what the state of that meeting room is, because we have state machines. And based on the state, it will know I need to fetch this document from Alfresco, and we're currently in page number 1, right? And so now I can click these little arrows, and as you can see, automatically the views get synchronized. And so I've tested this with 7 devices. In theory, the framework that I'm using should support several thousand concurrent devices, but I don't have high hopes for that. But the basic premise, I think, is a very straightforward one, and I think it forms the foundation for what I think could be a really great use of Alfresco content for collaboration in a new and different way that we normally are not accustomed to seeing Alfresco being used at. So that's my quick little CoPresent app, and we can look at the code a little bit later if there's time. There's going to be a plea for help a little bit later. So, but here's how you can use AlfJS. You can basically grab the code from Git. I assume that you have Node.js, and I have a build tool called Grunt. There's it's just another library, and Grunt is used to build all the JavaScript and everything else. So once you do that, then you have a server that's ready to go. Okay, so anyway, I'd like to add CMS support and all this kind of stuff to AlfJS. So maybe one day, you guys can help me do that. So let's go ahead and move to the presentation now and go on. Oh, there's I was looking for my spotlight. I was wondering why it didn't appear. All right. So we look at so now I'd like to actually show you a couple of the demo apps. I forgot I had a bunch of other demos, so let's go ahead and do that real quick. Any questions so far before I continue? Yes?
Do you provide APIs for the workflow?
APIs for workflow, it's very simplistic right now, so no. I'm only invoking basically the JSON services for basically logging in, getting sites, getting a doclib, getting a folder, getting a node. So definitely there's a lot of room for growth. And workflow is something that I'd love to add. Also, remember I mentioned this is a read-only API today. So being able to upload stuff, I think, is going to be also very important. Before I actually show this example, this is I want to show you the source code to it. And so this is a simple Ember.js based app. And what I'd like to demonstrate now is just kind of how a slightly less trivial app would look like. And so what I've got here, and is the font big enough? Let me go ahead and increase it there. Okay, so hopefully that's big enough there. So I have my application, and so this is my JavaScript here. And as before, I use ember.application.create to create my application namespace, and I just call it generically app. I know, not very original. And one of the things I want to have in this app is a controller that is responsible for manipulating a data model. The data model itself is just a JavaScript array, and so Ember provides a convenience object type called or class called array controller, which basically looks like an array as far as JavaScript is concerned. However, it supports data bindings and key value observing. And so I set the controller's content property. It's by convention, almost every Ember object and stuff like that has a property called content, which represents any data that encapsulates. So I set its content property to an empty array, and I have a function here called add item, where I'm going to add whatever I type in a text field into this array. So all I'm really doing here is using the this.get notation to grab the content array, and then I'm going to tell the array to go ahead and push that object in there. Now there's a little bit more to the app, so I'm going to jump down, and obviously you notice there's a commented out section, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But in here, we have a view. And Ember provides a bunch of different views for rendering things like text fields and buttons and all these other things. But you can also create a view that is simply bound to a handlebars template. And so here I just set the template name to something called application, and that's it. It's just a generic view called application view. And I create another subclass of text field called add item field. And here I use an existing method. I'm overriding an existing method for when you insert a new line or carriage return on using your keyboard, so it supports keyboard bindings, right? To basically grab the value of the text field and then send it off to the application controller, okay, and invoke the add item function, right? So this is gonna, this is how. So whenever I press return on my text field, it's going to add a new item to the array. And because Ember encourages you to use state charts, there's a very simple state chart here called a router. And it just has one state, which is the root state. And I'm not going to go into more detail. I'm just going to keep it at that. So after I set everything up, I initialize the app, and it's ready to run. So if I revisit my browser here and just kind of refresh, just make sure it's all hunky-dory, nice. I'm going to just type in some content in here and ignore the get sites button. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'm just going to type something, and the moment I press return, it should add it to a list on the bottom. So let's look at the way that the view works now. Okay, the view is, I just put inside the HTML, okay, and right here we have a script of type text handlebars, and this is what tells the Ember runtime and the more importantly the handlebars runtime, you know, what to bind itself to, and more importantly, it has, using a data attribute, we give the template a name called application. So remember when I created a view and I said that its template was called application? That's how it binds the two. And what happens is that when Ember initializes that particular view template, and it, by the way, it gets compiled into JavaScript, so it becomes just a JavaScript class. It will automatically set some scope, some properties and so forth that are immediately accessible to the view. So for example, I can invoke the add item field, for example, and insert it in here. And I can do things, well, that button we'll ignore for now, but I can access the controller because that's preset for you. So it is a little bit magical that the controller was pre-bound to the view, but the way that Ember works, it tries to kind of minimize a lot of the boilerplate for you. And so what I'm going to do here is using a loop helper, basically, an iterator helper. I'm going to iterate through every item in the controller. Remember, the controller pretends to be an array, right? It exposes itself as an array, so I can do standard array manipulations with it. And so for each item in the array, I'm going to basically render a table row and just insert the item's value. Okay? So that's how this is working, and so I can just keep doing that. And you can look at more complex examples of Ember apps. One of the canonical examples for virtually every MVC JavaScript framework is a to-do list, a task list. And so Ember has the obligatory to-do list demo or sample, and you can review that and learn a little bit more about it. All right, so far so good. Any questions about what I've shown you so far? Because the next step is to invoke AlfJS, just to kind of show you how that would work. Yes?
So each event creates a new table here, so...
A new table cell, yes. Or table row and a cell within it.
Or whole table.
Oh, no. So actually Ember, or in handlebars particularly in this case, but it'll insert a new table cell. It does not have to re-render the whole table. Okay? So basically, if I were to do a view source here, and let's just go ahead and kind of take a look here. So what you're going to see is that Ember inserts the script tags right here, and there's a reason why I use script tags. Don't get too confused by them, but think of them as markers. Think of them as markers basically allowing Ember through jQuery to find any element, any UI element that it manages, okay? And that way it can update just that DOM element, which means that instead of re-rendering the table, I can look at the script that marks the beginning of the table, which is this metamorph1, okay? And if I need to re-render the table, then I target that, and it will re-render the table. But if all I'm doing is entering new cells, then I want to do this one here, or actually not that one, I'm sorry. It was actually this one up here. But anyway, so the point is that it will just insert new DOM elements directly in there. And if you ever change an existing DOM element, it already knows because data bindings, they do their magic, right? So it just looks for that specific element and swaps it out. So it's very, very efficient. Okay, and more importantly, you don't get flicker, right? And that's really why you have it. Great question.
Once more, because
Can we what?
can you show this template?
The template, yeah. It's an important concept, so let's look at it again. So there's the template. Okay.
It seems to render the whole table every time.
No, when a new item is inserted, okay, yeah, so let's look at this, at the example here. Oh, I see what you mean, because we have the loop. You're saying it renders it every single time. Yes, but there are optimizations built specifically within the each helper to actually do that, because the each helper itself is bound to the array, and it knows specifically, we get an event notification letting us know specifically which element in the array was the one that changed. So it's very optimized, yes. So yeah, it's...
So we could write this code so only added element is added to the DOM, not
Right, and that's what's happening. That's what the each helper does for you. Okay, it's smart enough to do that. Yeah, so it's really clever stuff. And I remember being in the office with Yehuda Katz and Tom Dale when they like settled on this specific model, especially using script tags, because script tags don't render, and that's a beautiful thing. Because it means that you can actually insert them in tables like this, and it won't cause weird table formatting issues. There's one special case around IE6, but who cares about IE6, right? But they actually worked around it. Yes, you had a question.
Each handler understands if you change the third element and if it's only the
Yes, and it only adjusts that one. Yes, it's very cool in that respect. Okay, because it's actually rendered once. It's already been, so each helper will iterate through the list, and the list started at 0, right? But it's bound to the array, and the array changes, then we just go ahead and slap in the new value. Very cool stuff. I get amazed. So anyway, if those guys stopped arguing as much as they normally do and actually like continue to build code, Ember 1.0 would be finally released. But anyway, they're close. So anyway, so let's go ahead and do the AlfJS thing. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes already? Wow, jeez. Okay, so we're gonna stop with this little part here. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to add a new function, and this is why I had this commented out, that is called getSites, and it just uses AlfJS to, as before, create a connection. We're gonna call the login function, and once we successfully log in, I'm gonna call getSites. And notice I'm going to set the content property of, I use self, and those of you that develop in JavaScript, you know why I do this, because we got nested functions and so forth. And the scope of this, the this keyword, is now set to the function as opposed to the container or the parent. So I'm going to basically call the set method, because remember, gets and sets are bindings aware, right? I set the content property to the site list. In this particular case, every time I hit the get sites, it will re-render the whole thing, right? Because it's not particularly efficient. I'm not manipulating specific elements in the array. So in any case, once I make that change there, I need to change my index.html because the JSON structure that I get back happens to be not just single strings, but it's a whole JSON tree structure. And in this particular case, the items have a title property. So I'm just going to change this to render item.title. So go ahead and hit save, and I will, oops, wrong, there we go. Let's refresh this, and let's get rid of this. Okay, so now I'm just going to press the get sites button. And what should happen is we call and get the sites back. By the way, this is still working, so I should be able to do that. Whoops, that's not what I want. There we go. Come on. Oh, right, item.title. So anyway, forget about that. But you notice an empty element did get added right in there. So any questions about this? No?
But AlfJS means connect to local object. How connect to another site? How JavaScript can use?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. So I mentioned this in passing when I showed my proposed architecture. So the question was, how is it that AlfJS can connect to an Alfresco server when it's clearly being served from like localhost in this example, right? And presumably the Alfresco server is elsewhere. And in fact, if you looked at the code, you see that the actual Alfresco server is hosted on alfrescolabs.net, right? So how am I getting around the same origin policy? That's part of the model that of the architecture that I proposed, which is the use of proxies. So actually in here, the way that I'm previewing this app, I'm using a Node.js server that it's only like a whopping like 40 lines or something like that. Here it is. Here's the code. So okay, a little more than 40, 72 lines long. And what I did is I implemented an Ajax proxy. And the Ajax proxy allows me to connect to that, and that in turn connects to whatever I define in the back end. Yes, I should lock it down for security reasons and stuff like that, but that's okay. Yeah, I mean, that's easy to do. The point is that this is the way I do it here. There's another approach, which is called CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing, which uses a certain set of standardized HTTP headers to allow browsers to connect. However, well, it's supported in all major browsers except IE 9, 8, 7, 6, and yes. Well, 8 and 9 sort of kind of supported, but they restrict what HTTP verbs you can use. So anyway, so moving along. Right, so the proxy and everything else. It's a nice, simple model, and if I were to look at the just the web inspector for a moment and hit network, and let me just go ahead and hit share sites. You can see right here, see how the call works. It's looking at localhost and then underscore proxy and then the full URL to the Alfresco server, right? So anyway, that's it. So let's move to the presentation and wrap this up. Fortunately, I am almost done. So so the sample apps that I showed you are the Ember AlfJS sample, CoPresent. I was going to show you the Deja HTML5 viewer, and I also wanted to show you SkyDrop, and maybe I'll do this really quickly here because I'm really proud of this. It is how I overcame my fear of native Mac development or Objective-C. So basically, I wanted to make it really easy to share files in Alfresco in the cloud. And so let's say that I have, for example, I have some logos or screenshots here. So if I take this screenshot, I want to be able to quickly upload it to cloud and then get a URL that I can share with my friends, right, or my colleagues. So unfortunately, my icon is kind of hiding on me. Where is it? So I can't see it. Let me just quit some of these things. There we go. That's my SkyDrop icon right there. That's my little app. It's a menu helper. And so what I can do is I can grab my document and just push it out here. And so what's happening here is that it's talking to a Node.js server, which is in turn sending it to Alfresco in the cloud. Okay? You heard a little ding. That means that the document was uploaded. And now in my clipboard, I have a really nice little URL that I can just hit. And that takes me to an Ember.js app that is also talking to the same Node.js middleware. And now I can download that document. So this document is in the cloud, in Alfresco in the cloud, but I'm going to quickly access it and download it using this little tool. And now that's it. So that was it. Okay. Moving on. I would happily answer your questions after the, maybe after the session. So some best practices around HTML5. These are things you probably already know, but use responsive layouts when possible. Twitter Bootstrap is a great way to start, but there are plenty of other CSS tools and libraries that you can use. Build tools are very powerful. I've been using Yeoman, Yeoman.io. Yeah, I put it in there. And it's a really great tool. Grunt is a little bit more simplistic and might be good for smaller projects. So what these do is that they can do things like automatically, they have a preview server environment that watches your project directory and automatically collects a bunch of separate JavaScript files and concatenates them and minifies them and everything else. So it's a really, really nice tool. For Ruby on Rails geeks, there's a rake pipeline thing that supports it and whatnot. And also I recommend that you guys start exploring state charts for any kind of client-side app, even more traditional desktop types of apps. For mobile, the single biggest thing that I recommend is that you restrict your viewport size, and there's a meta tag that's supported by pretty much all mobile WebKit browsers to do this. And also limit yourself to the basic touch events. So in JavaScript, you have touch start and touch end, and that basically gives you the event itself carries the XY coordinates of a touch. It does support multi-touch, but the way that it supports multi-touch is by giving you an array of touches, and then you have to manually implement your own tracking code. That's a pain in the butt. So keep it to single finger, fat finger targets, and use touch start and touch end if you need to deal with any touch specific events. Simple swipes are generally okay because if you want to track a left to right swipe, all you need to do is compare the X value of the previous touch and the next touch, and then you're good to go. So that's it there. I have a lot of ideas about different apps that you can and should, that I would love to see developed on Alfresco, something like an Evernote or Pinterest to facilitate capture and discovery of content. And then I can imagine a product catalog being built using these types of frameworks so that if I'm in a car dealership and I want to show my different cars and all the options, the patent leather and the color options and everything else in a nice little tablet app, I think it would be kind of sweet. And I have this vision, which unfortunately I cannot execute on my own, that AlfJS can become kind of a wrapper for two sub-libraries. One that I will call share.js, which would be a unified Alfresco share client that wraps around the Slingshot JSON libraries and JSON REST services, and also CMS.js. And this library, this unified AlfJS would be smart enough to kind of toggle and switch between the two depending on what kind of environment you would hit. And it would also be tuned for Alfresco in the cloud with OAuth support and all that stuff so that you can just develop your content-rich HTML5 apps once and in theory, more or less, run them anywhere. But of course, I'm never going to say that you actually will be able to without some tweaks. So to wrap it up, I think Alfresco is a viable platform for content-rich apps. HTML5 and the frequency of browser releases nowadays bring a lot of improvement in performance. Like I'm amazed every single time that Chrome and Firefox get released. There's always something that's better and faster, with the occasional new bugs. So responsive design is not hard, so just always think responsive from the beginning, and I think with your help, and I really do want help, we can make this like vision of mine a reality. So thank you very much, guys.